Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 18 tight end rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be introducing individual players and, of course, justifying their overall rankings with statistics so that when we approach our 2024 fantasy football drafts, we can make the most informed decisions possible. Now, as I progress throughout today's video, a couple reminders. Every statistic that I do mention regarding these players is going to be for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Additionally, if you are looking for my specific thoughts on a player, travel down to the description because there are timestamps down there for every single one of my videos. While you're down there, of course, be sure to subscribe. We are on our way to 100,000 subscribers. I cannot thank you guys enough for the support. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season with the singular goal of trying to help you guys capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. Also, while you're down there, if you guys are trying to get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings for this offseason, be sure to check out the Patreon or go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, those rankings, those will be sent to you from my email directly to yours. Every subsequent ranking for the rest of the month will also be directly emailed to you. On top of that, you'll get rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, weeks 1 through 18. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex, kickers, defense, all of the above. So be sure to take advantage of the opportunity, get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. And for those of you who are wondering if you're eligible to sign up via Underdog Fantasy, check out the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your location. And of course, draft responsibly. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about my top 18 tight end rankings, beginning with our number one, Travis Kelce. Now, like I mentioned yesterday, the primary reason why I have Tyreek Hill as my number one wide receiver, and now why I have, Travis Kelce as my number one tight end isn't because they both played for the Chiefs. It's because I'm looking for sustained excellence at the position, and specifically for the number one overall player that I rank at said position. And that's exactly what Travis Kelce has done over the years. I mean, between 2016 and 2020, it was 5 consecutive seasons of him posting as the number one overall tight end in fantasy football. And even though the last 3 years hasn't been as glorious, yes, he has still been a top 3 tight end in the last 3 seasons. Yes, he's been dethroned from being the number one overall player. But again, he is still reliable enough to be at the top of the pack when we approach the 2024 season. Now, even though last season, Travis Kelce's overall efforts between weeks 2 and 22, so we're talking about the beginning of his regular season, because of course he missed week 1 of last year due to an injury. The beginning of his regular season up into the Super Bowl, he was averaging 8.31 targets per game and 12.78 fantasy points per game. But for many of us, that's underwhelming for the Travis Kelce standard that we know and love. I mean, you go back to 2022, Travis Kelce from weeks 1 through 22 up until the Super Bowl, averaging 9.15 targets per game and 16.23 fantasy points per game. Now, there could be a conversation of the potential which this offense took a step back in 2023, having scored only 37 total offensive touchdowns in comparison to 50 plus the 2 years prior. If in fact you bring in guys like Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, and they're going to elevate this offense and specifically elevate Patrick Mahomes, it is only going to help benefit Travis Kelce. Because many of you may be thinking, well, there's going to be target competition. Isn't that going to lower Travis Kelce's overall ceiling of potential? I don't see that as such, because over the course of the last 3 seasons, 2021 through 2023, the Kansas City Chiefs are number one amongst all teams in terms of total tight end targets. On a per season average, they are targeting their tight ends 178 times. Travis Kelce is going to have opportunity. The overall competition of targets has never been an issue for him. I mean, Tyreek Hill was on this team at one point and garnering over 160 targets within the given years. Nonetheless, I believe that Travis Kelce being the first tight end selected off the board is a great investment to give yourself a positional advantage as you approach your 2024 fantasy leagues, because you know you're going to find a lot of consistency there, and that positional advantage is going to go a long way, especially with the tight end position this season in terms of their overall ADPs being far less value than it has in seasons past. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our number 2, the player that dethroned Travis Kelce and was the number 1 overall ranked tight end during the 2023 season. We have Sam LaPorta of the Detroit Lions. Sam LaPorta coming off of a rookie season in which he put together the greatest rookie tight end performance of all time. I mean, we're talking about 80 plus receptions, over 800 receiving yards, double-digit touchdowns. This was something that many of us speculated there's a potential in which, of course, the Detroit Lions are going to get him implemented. He's immediately going to make an impact, but we didn't expect him to be the number one overall tight end by the end of the season. Nonetheless, Sam LaPorta, his overall efforts consisted of 7.37 targets per game and 11.53 fantasy points per game when you take the averages between weeks 1 through weeks 21 up until the NFC Championship game. And yes, there was a stint of time throughout that span in which he was dealing with an injury. Even if you exclude that game, still having great overall numbers, averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Now, the expectation for many of us is if you're going to come out of the gates and immediately become the number one overall tight end within your rookie season, the expectation would be, he's a young player and he's still learning, and he's only getting better as time progresses, as he builds more of a rapport with Jared Goff. And I agree with those overall sentiments. I think he is only going to improve in 2024. The only question is, can he score double-digit touchdowns once again? Because we know that he is going to get the target opportunity, and we know he's going to deliver once the ball is in his hands and he's making plays after the catch. It's just a matter of, is he going to get enough opportunity within the red zone to be able to sustain this overall expectation of being a top 2 tight end in 2024? You have guys like David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who are all vying for overall opportunities within the red zone. But as long as this Detroit Lions offense continues to be successful as they were last season, I expect Sam LaPorta to continue to deliver in the red zone. Specifically, if you look at statistics from the Detroit Lions offense in 2022 and in 2023, in both of those seasons, their tight ends had a minimum of 8 receiving touchdowns within the red zone. You go back to 2022, whether it was TJ Hockenson prior to him being traded, or the plethora of tight ends they used after that trade, up until last year with Sam LaPorta getting 8 red zone touchdowns. I think going into this year, we should continue to see sustained excellence from Sam LaPorta and have himself another fantastic season. But in my opinion, the number 2 overall tight end. Moving on to our number 3, the beginning of our A tier, someone who I very much so considered to be potentially an S tier player, and someone who very easily could end up finishing as the number 1 overall tight end. It is Mark Andrews of the Baltimore Ravens. If it wasn't for the fact that he had, a season-ending injury last year, he very easily should have been the number 1 overall tight end, and I'll tell you why. Besides the fact that he's been one of the most consistent tight ends since 2019, in fact, from 2019 through 2022, has always ranked as a top 5 tight end in fantasy football half PPR scoring, but most recently in 2021 was the number 1 overall tight end in fantasy football. Now, he could have very easily been the number 1 overall tight end in 2023 because of his overall averages. From weeks 2 through 10, when he was healthy, he was averaging 6.5 targets per game and 12.18 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, was the number 3 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points per game and total points. If you had gone ahead and taken his pace of play and expanded upon 17 games, he was on pace for 111 targets, 81 receptions, 984 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns, and 207.02 fantasy points, which would have made Mark Andrews the number 1 overall tight end in 2023. So the idea of having Mark Andrews be the first tight end come off the board in our 2024 fantasy football drafts, in my opinion, isn't crazy. I mean, you look at his overall production with Lamar Jackson when healthy from 2021 to 2023, he's averaging 12.36 fantasy points per game with Lamar Jackson. That's an uptick in terms of his overall production from last season. Now, we know that this offense isn't a pass-heavy scheme, but they love to throw the ball to their number 1 target, Mark Andrews, in comparison to guys like Sam LaPorta or potentially Trey McBride, who are going to be the number 2s of their offense behind guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown and, of course, Marvin Harrison, Jr. The thing about Mark Andrews is he is always going to be the de facto number 1 ahead of guys like Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman within this Baltimore Ravens offense. He is Lamar Jackson's safety blanket, especially down in the red zone, in which he's able to find himself a lot of success. Since 2019, no other players on the Baltimore Ravens have more red zone targets and red zone receiving touchdowns than Mark Andrews. I expect a lot of success from him going into this upcoming year, and as long as he stays healthy, can very easily vie for a top 2 position. Moving on to our number 4. And the last player that I wanted to mention within the A tier, it is Trey McBride, tight end of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, to begin the 2023 season, Trey McBride was the backup tight end. Zach Ertz, of course, was still there with the Arizona Cardinals. And from weeks 1 through 7, Zach Ertz continued to be the starter, and Trey McBride took a back seat. Throughout that span of time, Trey McBride, with a healthy Zach Ertz in the lineup weeks 1 through 7, was averaging 3 targets per game and 3.5 fantasy points per game. But once, in fact, Zach Ertz sustained his season-ending injury, from weeks 8 through 18, the remainder of the season without Zach Ertz in the lineup, of course, Trey McBride took over. 8.5 targets per game, 11.65 fantasy points per game, and was the number 4 overall tight end in terms of overall points and the number 6 in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Now, once Kyler Murray returned from weeks 10 through 18, the overall success that Trey McBride found was going to continue. I mean, this offense was predicated on heavily involving the tight end position with Kyler Murray. 8.25 targets, 11.54 fantasy points per game. He was able to get himself a 25.5% target rate, which is targets per route run. Again, amongst all players on that team, had the highest target share. But additionally, the tight end position had a very high target share, garnering 34% of the overall passing attempts that Kyler Murray had throughout weeks 10 through 18. Amongst all tight ends last season, Trey McBride was number 2 in terms of yards per route run and was number 2 in terms of yards after the catch. He is a dynamic receiving tight end, and I only believe that they're going to implement him more within this offense, primarily because of the coaching staff. When you take into account that the Arizona Cardinals were tied for number 1 in terms of tight end targets in 2023 with the Minnesota Vikings, they targeted their tight ends 179 times. When you take that into account, on top of the fact that Drew Pensick, their offensive coordinator, is a former Cleveland Browns tight end coach. I mean, again, we know how much the Cleveland Browns want to utilize their tight ends, and we'll mention that when we discuss David Njoku in just a moment. But in regards to their overall coaching scheme, they want to prioritize focusing on the tight end position. I don't believe there to be enough of a target competition within this offense. Even though Marvin Harrison is joining, they're bringing in guys like Zay Jones. I believe that Trey McBride is going to be the number 2 receiving option in this offense and continue to succeed in 2024. My number 5 is Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. There's a lot of potential in 2024 for Dalton Kincaid to be the number 1 receiving option of the Buffalo Bills offense. Now, that's obviously because of the target vacancies. There's no more Stephon Diggs. There's no more Gabriel Davis, Deontay Hardy, Sherfield. All of those receivers are gone. And again, when you take out someone like Stephon Diggs, who's been vying for 160 plus targets each of the last 4 seasons within this offense, when you remove him from the overall equation, I mean, just taking into account that 50% of the overall targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns from the 2023 Buffalo Bills offense is not returning to the team in 2024 leads me to believe that there is a lot of opportunity for Dalton Kincaid to step up. Now, last season as a rookie, from weeks 1 through 7, he played with Dawson Knox, another one of these tight ends that has been signed to a contract within this organization. And of course, they want to utilize the tight end position. Throughout that span of time, 4.5 targets per game, 5.3 fantasy points per game. Underwhelming to begin his 2023 rookie campaign. But once we saw Dawson Knox go down with an injury, from weeks 8 through 12, Dalton Kincaid took over. 7.4 targets per game and 10.72 fantasy points per game, promising numbers. Unfortunately, there was a reality in which, of course, Dawson Knox returned to the team throughout that span of time between weeks 14 through 20 going into the NFL playoffs. Dalton Kincaid only averaging 5.4 targets, only 6.97 fantasy points per game. And many of you may be wondering, well, Andrew, isn't Dawson Knox going to still be on the team in 2024? Absolutely. But the thing is, Dawson Knox really isn't the impending doom of Dalton Kincaid. When you look at weeks 14 through 20, when both of them played together, Dawson Knox was averaging 1.57 targets per game. He isn't a huge weapon within this offense, but in fact, Dalton Kincaid is going to be focused on as the primary number 1 going into 2024. They really are building their team in a similar way in which the Kansas City Chiefs have done in the past, using Travis Kelce as their number 1 and not paying the wide receiver position and having yourself an elite wide receiver 1 like Stephon Diggs. They decided to remove him from the overall equation, similar to the way in which, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs removed Tyreek Hill from their overall equation. Nonetheless, I do anticipate Dalton Kincaid to have himself 120, 130 plus targets this season. And with his incredible 80+% catch rate that he had last season and the overall volume of opportunity that he is going to be given and his athleticism and ability to find himself success within the red zone, I do expect Dalton Kincaid in 2024 to deliver for many of our fantasy teams. Our number 6 is George Kittle, one of the most consistent tight ends in fantasy football over the course of the last couple seasons. I mean, every season that he has been healthy, going back to 2018, he has always been a top 5 tight end. And you may be wondering, Andrew, why do you have him at number 6? Well, there is potential for guys like Dalton Kincaid and Trey McBride to have far greater overall volume of opportunity in terms of targets, in terms of exposure, in comparison to what George Kittle has seen over the course of the last couple seasons. On a per game average, he is the number 3 overall receiving option on this team and very closely almost the number 4 behind guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and of course competing for targets with guys like Christian McCaffrey. So if you're the number 3/number 4 option of your offense, and your offense amongst all teams in the National Football League in 2023 had the least passing attempts you may be a little bit worried about the potential of George Kittle if he doesn't score as many touchdowns within an upcoming season. Now, even though he's been able to find himself a lot of success with the lack of opportunities within this offense, like all the other receiving options have, from 2022 to 2023, in games in which he played with Brock Purdy, 5.68 targets per game, which has led to an incredible 11.65 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. The main reason why he continues to be at the top of the pack is because of what he's capable of doing within this offense, the way that Kyle Shanahan schemes him open, and of course, his ability to make plays after the catch. He was number 1 amongst all tight ends in terms of yards per route run, and he was number 3 in terms of yards after the catch. He is a very talented tight end. The only, glaring issue is the fact that he is the number 3 receiving option within this offense. When they get down into the red zone, there's the rushing threat and receiving threat of Christian McCaffrey. Additionally, the rushing and receiving threat of Deebo Samuel. And then there's guys like Brandon Ayuk, and then maybe George Kittle within the overall conversation. That in itself, with the addition of someone like Ricky Pearsall, who could potentially end up making himself very much so well known within this offense early, it does concern me. Nonetheless, still very much so a top tier tight end to draft in 2024. Our number 7 to begin the C tier is Kyle Pitts. Going back to 2021, his rookie season, with Matt Ryan, with an actual functioning quarterback, he finishes the number 7 overall tight end in fantasy football. The 2 seasons after, of course, he dealt with injury, but he also dealt with terrible quarterback play from guys like Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, and a little bit of Taylor Heineke. Nonetheless, over the course of the last 2 seasons, ranked as the number 32 and the number 16 overall tight end for fantasy purposes. But now we go ahead and potentially, approach better days with Kirk Cousins. And the reason why I say that these are better days is because over the course of the last 2 seasons, with Ridder, Mariota, and Heineke, they consisted of 38.4% of their overall passes that were 10 yards down the field or further to be uncatchable or inaccurate. That just goes to show just how much of a disadvantage Kyle Pitts had every single time he ran a route in the last 2 seasons. On top of the fact that, yes, he was dealing with injuries, but now that he's healthy and he approaches this offense with Kirk Cousins, who in that specific category in terms of uncatchable or inaccurate passes 10 or more yards down the field over the course of the last 2 seasons, has been the 3rd best quarterback in that category. But we have also seen Kirk Cousins elevate other tight ends, such as TJ Hockenson. So why not Kyle Pitts? Specifically, if you go back to 2022, from weeks 9 through 17, when Hockenson was with this team and with Kirk Cousins in the lineup, Hockenson was averaging 9.4 targets per game and 10.87 fantasy points per game. You go to 2023, from weeks 1 through 8, while Kirk Cousins was, of course, healthy, 8.5 targets per game and 11.29 fantasy points per game for TJ Hockenson. Anytime that guy like Kyle Pitts, over the course of his 3-year career, has been given 8 or more targets per game, he's averaging 11.13 fantasy points per game. Again, in the 44 games that he has played, only 10 of them have consisted of 8 or more targets. The opportunities are absolutely going to be there for Kyle Pitts, and that's why I have him so highly ranked. Many of us have been burnt by him in the past, but this offense with Kirk Cousins and now Zach Robinson being the offensive coordinator, we have to remember, Zach Robinson from the Sean McVay coaching tree, they are going to implement a very similar scheme to one that Kirk Cousins ran in Minnesota last season because, of course, a guy like Kevin O'Connell, the head coach and primary play caller of the Minnesota Vikings, he is also from the Sean McVay coaching tree. All these offenses are going to look the same. So if they're going to utilize Kyle Pitts in the TJ Hockenson role, he's going to find himself a lot of success. Not to mention the fact that Zach Robinson, a former passing game coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams in 2021 and 2022, he helped Tyler Higbee get into top 10 in terms of overall routes run between those 2 seasons. So I do anticipate a lot of opportunity going in the direction of Kyle Pitts in 2024. On number 8 is Evan Engram. Evan Engram, over the course of the last 2 seasons, since joining the Jacksonville Jaguars, has finished as the number 5 and the number 2 overall tight end. So you may be wondering, why is he number 8? Let me go ahead and give you guys a little bit of an understanding as to how I've come to this conclusion. Yes, Evan Engram was fantastic last season, averaging 8.41 targets per game and 10.19 fantasy points per game. And over the course of the last 2 seasons, the Jacksonville Jaguars have targeted their tight ends the 6th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, obviously thanks to Doug Peterson, the head coach and primary play caller of this offense. Doug Peterson has proven over the course of his coaching career that he always wants to heavily utilize the tight end position. Going back to his days from 2018 through 2020 with the Philadelphia Eagles, the Eagles were number 1 amongst all teams in terms of tight end targets throughout that span of time. And in fact, to even go further, Doug Peterson, going back till 2016, has always had a tight end 1 within every single one of his seasons as a head coach in the National Football League. So again, why isn't Evan Engram higher? Well, going back to last season, one of the primary reasons that Evan Engram was able to elevate himself to finishing as the number 2 overall tight end in fantasy football was because of the absence of Christian Kirk. From weeks 1 through 12, when Christian Kirk was healthy, Evan Engram was averaging 7.45 targets per game and 7.49 fantasy points per game. In comparison to all the other tight ends that we spoke about earlier, 7.5 fantasy points per game, it doesn't even match up close. It's 4 points less than all these other guys have averaged over the course of the last couple seasons. But once, in fact, Christian Kirk went down with his season-ending injury from weeks 13 through 18, Evan Engram kicked it into overdrive, was averaging 10.2 targets per game and 15.15 fantasy points per game, and absolutely elevated himself into being in that top 2 conversation at the position. When you go ahead and look at the overall targets and usage within the slot position, Evan Engram and Kirk Cousins are both competing for slot targets. And when they're both healthy and on the field, it all goes in the direction of Christian Kirk. Therefore, going into 2024, I do anticipate Evan Engram to take a step back, but we cannot deny the fact that he's going to have himself a boatload of opportunity. And with the absence of now Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones both hitting free agency, there is going to be a target opportunity within this offense, even though they are bringing in guys like Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. The number 1 and number 2 options within this offense are Evan Engram and Christian Kirk, in whichever order you may see it fit. But Evan Engram's still going to be of value, just not as great as he was last season. Let's move on to the final player within this tier. We have Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. Jake Ferguson, within his first season as a starter, finishes as the number 8 overall tight end in fantasy football. And it really wasn't a surprise, mainly because the Dallas Cowboys have already demonstrated under the Mike McCarthy era that they want to heavily utilize the tight end position. That's exactly what they have done in seasons past. You go to 2021 and 2022, Dalton Schultz throughout that span of time finishes the number 9 and the number 3 overall tight end in fantasy football. So regardless of who the tight end is, they're going to see opportunity because, of course, Mike McCarthy sees it as fit. And, of course, Dak Prescott loves to get his tight ends utilization, especially down within the red zone. Last season, Jake Ferguson between weeks 1 through 19, so the entire regular season, into the NFL playoffs, averaging 6.33 targets per game and 9.66 fantasy points per game. And I only think he is going to improve now that he has a full season of experience under his belt, and this team has not brought in any other target competition. He is going to be the number 2 receiving option. It goes CeeDee Lamb, then him, and then Brandon Cooks. And going forward, I do anticipate to see Jake Ferguson improve and continue to develop his game. Last season, amongst all players in the National Football League, he was number 5 in targets, number 3 in receptions, and number 13 in total touchdowns within the red zone. All while we take into account that CeeDee Lamb was number 1 in targets and receiving touchdowns on his own team within the red zone, and amongst all players in the National Football League, I do believe that the Dallas Cowboys are going to continue to utilize him at a high rate, especially down where it matters most, getting touchdowns within the red zone. Jake Ferguson, a fantastic overall player for the 2024 season and one that we can rely upon at the tight end position. My number 10 is David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns. Here's the thing about David Njoku. He had himself an incredible finish to the 2023 season, but we can't take that at its face value and expect it to continue in 2024. I mean, yes, he finished as the number 12 and the number 7 overall tight end over the course of the last 2 seasons, but he finished strong from weeks 14 through 19 with Joe Flacco averaging 17.22 fantasy points per game throughout a 5-game span. Prior to that, over the course of the last 2 seasons, when David Njoku has played with a healthy Deshaun Watson, David Njoku is only averaging 6.83 fantasy points per game throughout the 10 games that they have played together. So as we approach the 2024 year, the question is, what David Njoku are we going to see? One that was, highly utilized, or one that, on the other hand, is diminishing his overall value because of the presence of Deshaun Watson? The Cleveland Browns do bring in a new offensive coordinator in Ken Dorsey, the former offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills from 2022-2023, prior to him being fired. But you have to remember that Kevin Stefanski, the head coach of this team, is still the primary play caller. Stefanski this offseason has gone ahead and doubled down on the idea of getting the ball to David Njoku. He talked about this offseason in a couple interviews, the idea of we're always trying to get Dave the ball. And in all of our thought processes going into weeks, we're specifically looking to implement guys, and Dave is at the top of the list. So as long as they continue with that focus, I believe that Kevin Stefanski is telling the truth and that he's going to get more utilization out of David Njoku this season, even with Sean Watson under center. I do believe he is a top 10 tight end going into the 2024 year. There is going to be ups and downs, but overall, he is going to be steady within the overall conversation. Moving on to our number 11, let's bring up the rookie tight end, Brock Bowers of the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, a couple of statistics in regards to tight ends who have been drafted as high as Brock Bowers just was during the 2024 NFL Draft. Of the 9 tight ends that were drafted in the first round between 2014 and 2023, the last decade of football, only 3 of them have finished as tight end ones within their rookie campaigns. Evan Engram, Kyle Pitts, and Dalton Kincaid. What all 3 of them had in common is that they all had 90 plus targets of opportunity within their rookie year. All other tight ends who were, first round draft picks, unfortunately weren't even past 70 targets within their rookie year. So they could not even compete with the other tight ends within this conversation like Evan Engram, Pitts, and Kincaid. But I do want to keep in mind, and I want you to remember the number 90 in terms of a watermark of success in terms of targets by rookie tight ends, because it is going to matter when I introduce the next topic of our conversation. The new Raiders offensive coordinator is Luke Getsy. He was the former offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills in 2022 and 2023. Throughout those 2 years, he was able to help Cole Kmet at a base minimum finish as the number 7 tight end in back-to-back seasons for fantasy football. Cole Kmet last season had 90 overall targets. And if we're going to continue to see Luke Getsy highly utilize the tight end position and specifically get Brock Bowers the ball 90 plus times in his rookie year, he could very easily become a top 12 overall prospect at the position, have very similar numbers potentially to someone like Dalton Kincaid last year, who, yes, wasn't as good of a rookie performance as Sam LaPorta, but there aren't very many Sam LaPortas in the world. Those are, anomalies within the overall conversation. Going into 2024, I do anticipate this offense to heavily utilize him after, of course, Devontae Adams. I know that they drafted Michael Mayer last season, but Michael Mayer is a better blocker than he is an actual pass-catching threat. So going into this upcoming season, I anticipate the Las Vegas Raiders to heavily utilize him, especially down in the red zone, in order to take advantage of all the skills that he has to offer. The final of our tight end ones is Dallas Goedert, our number 12. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, of course, has dealt with himself a fair share of injuries, missed a good amount of time, but yet has still been the number 11 and the number 14 overall tight end in fantasy football, because when he is active and healthy, he is still a great producer. Last season, from weeks 2 through 19, averaging 6.54 targets per game and 8.92 fantasy points per game. Now, even though Dallas Goedert is the number 3 receiving option of this offense and is always going to be the number 3 receiving option behind guys like A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, and even though red zone opportunities are non-existent for him within the overall scheme, I do believe that going into 2024, the change of offensive coordinator is only going to help accentuate the potential for success for Dallas Goedert, mainly because Kellen Moore, being brought into this overall conversation, loves to utilize the tight end position. As an offensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys, going back to 2019, or even most recently of the Los Angeles Chargers just this last season, he heavily utilizes the tight end position, specifically in the last 3 seasons in which, of course, Kellen Moore has been the offensive coordinator for, of course, the Chargers, and then 2 seasons of being the offensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys. The tight ends within those seasons on those teams combined for 179.4, 189.2, and 207.6 fantasy points. So what we know for sure is that there is going to be opportunity for Dallas Goedert to sustain his role, and that's what I anticipate. I expect him to sustain his role. Is he going to be able to produce, better numbers than he ever has in his career? That's always within the realm of possibility, but I'm anticipating him to sustain his overall contributions within this offense, and as long as he stays healthy, should be a fantastic top 12 tight end. Now let's go ahead and move on to the E tier, and let's talk about TJ Hockenson as a number 13. He is quite literally the only player in this tier because I see it as the top 12 tight ends, TJ Hockenson if you plan on investing within the overall opportunity, and in everybody else. So let's talk about TJ Hockenson, a player who over the course of the last 2 seasons has finished as a top 4 tight end in fantasy football, obviously thanks to the fact that he was traded to the Minnesota Vikings and all the opportunities that he's been given there. In 2023 last season, from weeks 1 through 15, prior to his overall injury, 8.79 targets per game, 11.69 fantasy points per game, was the number 2 overall tight end last season throughout that span of time, number 3 in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Of course, like I mentioned earlier on when we were talking about Trey McBride, the Minnesota Vikings and Arizona Cardinals both tied for most tight end targets amongst all teams last season with 179. Now, similar to the conversation that we had yesterday in regards to Justin Jefferson, how will TJ Hockenson perform in the absence of Kirk Cousins? Last season, we saw many of examples from weeks 9 through 15 without Kirk Cousins. Having guys like Josh Dobbs and Nick Mullins as a starting quarterback was even better for fantasy. 9.12 targets per game, 12.23 fantasy points per game. Again, regardless of who's played at quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings last season that wasn't named Kirk Cousins, Kevin O'Connell was able to elevate them and allow them to continue to get the ball to guys like Justin Jefferson, TJ Hockenson, and Jordan Addison at a high rate, and continue to allow these dominant threats over the field to continue to find success. Now, the main topic I wanted to go ahead and present, and why TJ Hockenson, despite all of these stats, is still number 13 and not within the top 2, is because, of course, he's coming off an ACL injury. Last season, of course, sustained that injury in December and didn't have surgery until January 29th, 2024. So if we take into account the 9-month recovery process that is going to be in line from a January 29th surgery date of completion, the expectation is that he's probably not going to return to play until November. And the reason why I believe that to be the case is because what we witnessed last season with Justin Jefferson and the way that Kevin O'Connell approached that situation, Justin Jefferson has spent 4 weeks on the injured reserve, and he said, hey, I'm ready to go. But Kevin O'Connell prevented him from playing for 3 more weeks after that, just to ensure that he was fully healthy and not going to return and injure himself once again. So I believe that the Minnesota Vikings in this upcoming season aren't going to risk it. They want to see TJ Hockenson fully healthy before they put him out there and have him run, 40 plus routes full speed within a singular game. So I anticipate him to be limited, and for the information regarding his return to be limited up until we get to, October, November. So if in fact you plan on investing into the overall idea of TJ Hockenson, understand that you may not get his overall services until week 9. If you do not have an injured reserve spot within your roster, it is probably not a great investment. If you have a tight end that you drafted as your number 1 overall tight end that has a bye week between weeks 1 through 9, it's probably not a good overall idea, because again, you won't have the services of TJ Hockenson, or at least that is my speculation going into this season. So understand, if he's only going to play between weeks 9 through 14 and you're not going to make the fantasy football playoffs, you're only getting 6 good games out of him. If, in fact, you make the fantasy football playoffs, fantastic. You can get him for even 3 more weeks, so 9 overall games in which you can help contribute to your team. And if he's even close to what he was last season, averaging 10, 11, 12 fantasy points per game, he can certainly help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship late within the year. Moving on to our number 14, the beginning of the F tier, we have Pat Freiermuth. The reason why I have Pat Freiermuth within this conversation is because of the quarterback improvements and, of course, the offensive coordinator change within the Pittsburgh Steelers organization. Of course, we have seen Pat Freiermuth in seasons past be a top 12, overall tight end, specifically in 2022. So it wasn't that long ago. But last season, riddled with injuries and also terrible quarterback play from guys like Pickett, Trubisky, and Rudolph, Pat Freiermuth really wasn't utilized much. Only 4.23 targets per game and only 5.45 fantasy points per game. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, when Pat Freiermuth has been just given 5 or more targets per game, he's averaging 9.37 fantasy points per game. With opportunity comes success for this tight end, and hopefully we're going to see that with new offensive coordinator Arthur Smith joining the organization. Last season amongst all teams, the Atlanta Falcons, who he was the primary play caller for and the head coach, the Atlanta Falcons targeted their tight ends 174 times. That was number 3 amongst all teams in the National Football League. Both Jonnu Smith and Kyle Pitts accumulated 50-plus receptions within the given year. They were both top 16 tight ends in fantasy football. So I believe with the improvements of play at the quarterback position with Russell Wilson and, of course, Justin Fields being brought in, who have both targeted their tight ends at a very high rate throughout their careers, I am anticipating that the entire change within this offense to elevate Pat Freiermuth and allow him to be within the conversation of potentially getting into the top 12, overall mix at tight end, but certainly being a valuable number 2 tight end when, in fact, your main guy either goes down with an injury or potentially is on a bye week. Moving on to my number 15, we have Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. Listen, Hunter Henry hasn't been a top 12 tight end since 2021. Throughout that year, 50 receptions, 603 yards, but 9 receiving touchdowns, which obviously helped elevate him into that conversation of finishing as the number 9 overall tight end. Specifically last season, with the most dysfunctional offense in New England Patriots history. Again, one of the lowest scoring, actually it was the lowest scoring offense in New England Patriots history since the year 2000. With Bailey Zappi, Mac Jones, it was a disaster. But throughout that span of time, Hunter Henry, one of the primary receiving threats, 4.36 targets per game. Imagine being the primary receiving threat and only 4 targets per game, but was able to score 7.06 fantasy points per game. In games in which he was given a vast majority of opportunity, of course, was scoring double-digit fantasy points on a consistent basis. So that's where I'm anticipating him to go in 2024. When you bring in a new offensive coordinator in Alex Van Pelt, who was the former offensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns, and you take into account the fact that the Cleveland Browns from 2021 to 2023 We're number 3 amongst all teams in terms of total tight end targets, and the fact that they want to continue to implement the tight end position at their primary focus. On top of the fact that this team doesn't have much competition in terms of targets. The number 1 wide receivers, Kendrick Bourne, Juju Smith-Schuster, KJ Osborne, 2 of the rookies they drafted. I mean, Polk is probably going to be the number 1 guy, but it'll take a little bit of time for him to kind of work into that role. Until then, it is going to be Hunter Henry as the number 1. And if, in fact, Jacoby Brissett takes the starting job and begins the season, it is only going to continue to elevate his overall potential, because we know that Jacoby Brissett, a couple years back with the Cleveland Browns, who obviously he's very much so familiar with Alex Van Pelt, was able to elevate David Njoku into a top 12 conversation, which hopefully maybe Hunter Henry can get into this season. Number 16, we have Cole Kmet, one of the most consistent tight ends over the last couple seasons. Again, like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the potential of someone like Brock Bowers, Cole Kmet has been a top 7 tight end in each of the last 2 seasons. And even though he has started slow each of the last 2 years, when you take into account 2023, weeks 4 through 16, he was averaging 10.26 fantasy points per game. A lot of success has been found at the tight end position within this offense. But now going forward with a new offensive coordinator, someone like Shane Waldron, and far more target competition, not only do you have to, of course, compete with DJ Moore, but now Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, Gerald Everett, DeAndre Swift, it's going to be tough for someone like Cole Kmet to continue to put up the high volume of overall fantasy points like he has done in seasons past, if it's not for a high volume of overall targets or a high volume of overall touchdowns, which again, with so much target competition, it's going to be difficult. Like I mentioned earlier, Shane Waldron comes in. He was the former offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks for the last 3 seasons. Throughout that span of time, the Seahawks targeted their tight ends the 15th most time amongst all teams, middle of the pack. But most recently in 2022, the tight ends of this offense of the Seattle Seahawks combined for 231 fantasy points. In that year, Noah Fent was the number 18 overall ranked tight end in 17 games. So Cole Kmet is probably going to be within that overall conversation. There's a reason why they brought in Gerald Everett. Gerald Everett has played for Shane Waldron in Los Angeles for the Rams, and of course has played with Shane Waldron in Seattle, so very familiar, and that is why they brought him in to, of course, unfortunately take away some target opportunity from Cole Kmet. Speaking of target competition, let's talk about Dalton Schultz, who is also dealing with a very similar situation. The last couple of seasons has been fantastic for him. Whether it's been with the Dallas Cowboys or Houston Texans, he has been a top 12 ranked tight end in all these scenarios. But unfortunately, he now has to deal with the target competition of Diggs, Collins, and Dell. And yes, we did see an influx of overall production out of a guy like Dalton Schultz in the absence of Tank Dell last season, but he won't have that luxury in 2024. Last season, from weeks 1 through 20, going into the NFL playoffs, 5.7 targets per game, 8.12 fantasy points per game. So if, in fact, this offense is going to continue to utilize Diggs, Dell, and Collins far ahead of the overall opportunities are going to go in the direction of Dalton Schultz, unless, very similar to Cole Kmet, he is going to see himself far more targets than we anticipate or far more touchdown upside than we anticipate, I think the number 17 rank is safe. And when you look at this overall offense and look at their overall personnel tendencies, amongst all teams in the National Football League last season, the Texans were bottom 10 in terms of overall 11 personnel usage, which is 1 tight end, 1 running back offensive sets. And they were bottom 5 in terms of 12 personnel usage, which is 1 running back and 2 tight end overall personnel. So again, is there enough opportunity as the number 4, potentially number 5 receiving option within this offense, assuming Joe Mixon gets himself within the work? I think Dalton Schultz, number 17, again, a solid tight end 2 for your roster when a bye week is to arise for your primary starter. The final tight end I wanted to mention is Taysom Hill. I honestly thought about putting Taysom Hill right next to TJ Hockenson because both of them can be investments that pan out for the greater if everything purely falls in the right direction. Taysom Hill over the course of the last 2 seasons has been the number 5 and the number 10 overall tight end for fantasy football. Last season averaged 8.44 fantasy points per game in games in which he played 10 or more offensive snaps. In games in which he was given 5 or more rushing attempts, averaged 13.57 fantasy points per game last season. And over the course of the last 2 seasons, in games in which he has been given 10 or more touches, averaging 14.84 fantasy points per game. The thing is, Taysom Hill is going to continue to always be a red zone threat for this offense because of the Wildcat offense that they utilize. He handled 35% of the New Orleans Saints rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line last season and 30% of the overall red zone rushing attempts within the offense. Yes, you bring in a new offensive coordinator, and that is where the primary uncertainty arises with Clint Kubiak. We don't know if Clint Kubiak is going to utilize him in a way in which we want to. Maybe Clint Kubiak, having been the passing game coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers last season, learned a thing or two from Kyle Shanahan, and maybe he'll utilize Taysom Hill within a Deebo Samuel-esque role, getting him usage out of the backfield, and hopefully continue to utilize the Wildcat scheme that has been so successful for the New Orleans Saints over the years. But again, we're not 100% sure, and that is why we currently sit in this situation. Without 100% certainty, it makes it very difficult to 100% trust that we can draft Taysom Hill and immediately make him a starter. Therefore, I have him at number 18, even though I think he very easily could be my number 14 ranked player. I have him here because there is still a lot of uncertainty as to how this offense is going to function and who is going to be given the primary opportunities in terms of rushing attempts and especially down within the red zone. That covers it for my top 18 tight ends for the 2024 fantasy football season. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, if you enjoyed today's content, click the like button, subscribe, because we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2024 season. Again, back tomorrow with our top 18 quarterback rankings. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.